Welcome back, and in this video we're going to talk about Alexander's continued conquests of the Persian Empire and beyond. From Egypt, Alexander now advances into Mesopotamia. His army is now grown to about 50,000 soldiers, but Darius still outnumbers him at least 2 to 1. They meet in the plains of Gaugamela. This was terrain that Darius had smoothed out so that the Persian chariots would be most effective, and this was one of the weapons that the Macedonians didn't have. They had cavalry and infantry, but they didn't have chariots. And so many of the Macedonian generals don't want to fight there. They say, why fight on territory that's been prepared to give an advantage to our enemy? Let's march somewhere else in the Persian Empire and force Darius to fight us there. But Alexander insists on fighting at Gaugamela, and he's confident that by defeating Darius there, he can lay claim to the whole of the Persian Empire. And so he uses the tactics of the Thebans, as you can see from the slide. You can see that he heavily weights one flank, and the other flank's just kind of making a holding action, and then the heavy flank is pushing the Persians back. Darius again loses his nerve and flees, and Alexander is able to destroy what remains of the Persian army. Move on to the next slide now. Gaugamela is significant because after Gaugamela, Alexander is able to occupy the rest of the Persian Empire. He takes the cities of Babylon and Susa. Even though there's some Persian fighting, some significant Persian opposition, stubborn Persian opposition, he's still able to capture the city of Persepolis, which he plunders and burns, partly as really kind of a party for the victorious army, partly as revenge for the destruction of Athens by the Persians in the Persian Wars. Alexander continues his pursuit of Darius, who was assassinated in 330. And Alexander, after Darius' assassination, claims to be Darius' successor. He takes the title of King of Sumer and Akkad, this ancient Mesopotamian title that we talked about way back in week 2. He presents himself as the unifier of ancient Mesopotamia, and also presents himself as the ruler of Persia. Beyond the Persian Empire, Alexander continues to expand. He marches north into Bactria and Afghanistan. The fighting is still ferocious. This is some of the most difficult terrain for invaders to win battles in the history of the world. Alexander is one of the few generals ever to have had success here. We have accounts of the king personally helping the stragglers in the Greek army make their way up the snow-covered slopes of the mountains. This is part of the charisma of Alexander, which meant that he was so beloved by his men. In the capture of the fortress of the Sogdian Rock, that gives the Macedonians control of much of this area of Bactria and Afghanistan, they capture the princess Roxana, with whom Alexander falls in love and marries. Move on to the next slide, we see that Alexander now turns south into India. Here, after most of the inhabitants of the Persian Empire accepted Alexander's rule after he had defeated Darius, they find much more stubborn resistance, that the inhabitants are fighting village to village and wearing down the Macedonians. There's a great battle at the Hydaspes River. The Macedonians were confronted by an army that included 85 war elephants, and the battle was desperate, but in the end, again, Alexander was victorious. But now the Macedonians in 326, 8 years after leaving their homes, are tired of war. They had been victorious, but people were still dying in these battles. You imagine having conquered the Persian Empire, having been away from home for 8 years, and still you die on campaign. And so most of them don't want to do this anymore. They want to return home. They'd heard frightening rumors of a powerful Indian empire into the interior. Of course, this only made Alexander want to march further and take on this empire, but his soldiers have totally the opposite reaction. They mutiny, and Alexander sulks in his tent for 3 days, but then is compelled to return. However, on the return, he insists on marching through the new lands across the desert of South Iran. There's ongoing fighting, and this fighting comes with a serious cost. The desert and the fighting both are brutal. 30,000 soldiers die on this march. It's actually Alexander the Great's greatest defeat. It's totally self-inflicted. He himself is wounded by an arrow to his lung, and we're told never walked without pain again. So the retreat or the return from India, even though Alexander had established a great empire, it was not without difficulty and not without cost. Alexander returned to Babylon. Babylon, remember, has this reputation as a holy city. Alexander is presenting himself as an heir to the gods. And so he returns to Babylon, to the capital of his empire, what he's going to make the capital of the greatest empire the world had yet known. And the question is, how is he going to govern this empire? And it's going to be a combination of factors. He's encouraged by what we call third wave Greek colonization that's taken place by land rather than by sea. That's Greeks who have left Greece, who have gone with the Macedonian army or who've followed the Macedonian army, who've settled in these lands. Alexander himself has built colonies named after himself, named Alexandria. But at the same time, and so this is going to provide a layer of Greek society that he can use to continue to govern this Greek empire and remain in control of it. However, at the same time, he also knows that he needs the cooperation of the Persians, the other conquered peoples, to maintain this empire. And so he follows the Persian imperial model. Acknowledge Alexander's supremacy, pay your taxes, and you can retain your native customs. And even he works hard to try and incorporate Persians into his government, Afghans into his army. The Macedonians don't really like this, but Alexander knows this is what's necessary to secure his empire. And his ambitions for extending this empire have not changed. He plans to attack Arabia. He plans to expand into the Western Mediterranean. He sends someone an admiral to explore the Indian Ocean. And so there's this huge expansion of Alexander's empire that is planned. However, tragedy strikes. Alexander's close friend Hephaestion dies unexpectedly. Alexander was struck with grief. He lived even more irresponsibly than he'd been living before. He drank even more heavily. He had wounds, like the wound in his lung from his campaigns that were catching up with him. Babylon is in an area with a lot of rivers, a lot of standing water, and so he gets sick. Some people said it was poisoned, and dies a few days later. And so this brings an end to Alexander's empire. He had made no will. He had married Roxana pretty late on in his campaign. He married a Persian princess after this. Both of them have sons, but both are very young, and both of them are assassinated, as is his half-brother Philip. And so his generals are going to divide the empire among them. Antigonus is going to take most of Anatolia and establish the Antigonid Empire. Seleucus is going to take Babylon in the east and establish the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy is going to take Egypt and establish the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And then one of Alexander's cousins, I'm trying to remember the name now. One of Alexander's cousins, I think Lysander. That'd be something to look up and to check. It's not important for you to know because he doesn't reign very long, but he takes control of Macedon. So these are the four empires that emerge after Alexander's death: Egypt, Babylon and the east, Anatolia, and Macedon. And these generals and their descendants are going to fight with one another for the next 40 years.